Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
We're continuing our discussion of the Rededicate 250 events over the weekend. On Monday's episode, we talked about the gathering Sean Feucht hosted with Eric Metaxas, Greg Locke, and Mark Driscoll at the Sylvan Theater on the National Mall Saturday night. I've also written two pieces for B&G this week about the weekend. The first article was titled, What I Saw and Heard in D.C. This Weekend, and the second one was titled, Here's What Baptists Said at Rededicate 250. You can find those pieces by clicking on the analysis section of B&G's website, going to my author page on B&G's website, or subscribing to my Substack so you have all article previews and links sent to your inbox when they come out. In our previous episode, we focused primarily on Sean Feucht's Let Us Worship gathering that happened Saturday night. And today we're going to mention that evening some, but mostly focus on the Trump administration's official rededication service that happened on Sunday. I went on the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast with Pat Conkey this week to talk about it, and over the past 2 days, our conversation has gotten nearly 30,000 views and over 600 comments. So it's garnered a lot of good discussion. I'll link the video in my Substack so you can interact with the comments if you'd like. One of the things we discuss in this conversation that I want to highlight before I share it is the attendance at the events. And the reason I'm bringing it up is that it's the number one question I've gotten by far. And because I've seen a lot of liberals making fun of Trump for having so few people show up by citing pictures taken of the event that depict a very small amount of people there. I haven't wanted to give a number publicly because I don't trust my precision on estimating crowd sizes, but the number my son and I both had in mind for Trump's event was around 18,000 people. And since then, and since this conversation was recorded, Katie Couric reported that there were around 15,000 people. So I think that's a good ballpark that makes sense of what we experienced. It definitely wasn't the crowd of 250,000 like a number of those evangelical worship gatherings have gotten over the past quarter century. But it also wasn't the total embarrassment that many on the left are trying to make it out to be. There was one meme going around that showed mostly empty grass. So I wrote on social media, the angle of the photo doesn't show the chair section, makes the front grass area look small, and doesn't show the crowds huddled on the outside of these areas under the shade of the trees. In fact, that empty grass area in the back is where I spent an hour and 50 minutes in long lines waiting for lunch. So while the AI photos from some on the right showing massive crowds are propaganda, this picture shared by those on the left is also propaganda. Sharing it takes away from the very real fact that the thousands of people who were there represent the millions of people who put those who were on the stage in power. In any case, for my second episode covering the Rededication 250 events, here's my conversation with Pat Conkey.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast. I'm Pat Conkey, and I'm here with a good friend of the channel, Rick Pidcock. He was on last month to talk about his book, Weapons of Worship, and today he's joining us to talk all about the Rededicate 250 event that happened in the Capitol this weekend. And I had family in town, and so I gave myself a mental health break by not watching this, although I'm going to be talking about it as I watch these things later this week. But Rick actually was there. He went there, so he took the opposite approach. So welcome, Rick. I'm glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's I'm a little tired because I just got in. I drove all night afterwards after being in the heat all day. So I got in at 4:45 in the morning, and I've already been to my daughter's elementary school thing and written an article, and so it's been like nonstop. Go. So.
Yeah, I figured it's quite a week for you. I know that a lot happened at this event. Why don't you start though by just telling us what it is for people who haven't heard about this Rededicate 250? Tell us what it is.
Yeah, so basically over this year, the Trump administration has been organizing these U.S. government-sponsored worship and revival services. There's another one that's going to be coming up at the, Mount Rushmore, for example, and there's been some smaller events here and there. So this one is on the National Mall, and it was called Rededicate 250. And basically the concept was that America needs to be rededicated to being one nation under God. And so they got together a group of, big name speakers and worship leaders and basically organized this entire event that was basically mainly made up of evangelicals with a couple Catholics and one Jewish rabbi to promote rededicating the nation to being under God.
So one thing that I heard about this, and you can tell me if this is fair. I read just a little bit about it, and what one person said is, yes, it was. There were people from different faiths there, but they were all people who were Trump supporters. Is that a true statement about the people who were speaking?
Yes, so there were people there that were Catholics, Baptists, charismatics, non-denominational Christians, the typical people that you've seen in a lot of these Christian nationalist conversations. And then there were a couple Catholics, or a couple, I mentioned the Catholics, but then there was one Jewish rabbi. And so there's some theological diversity. There's a lot of diversity between those groups theologically, but they all had allegiance to Trump, was what they had in common. And to this vision of being one nation under this Judeo-Christian God, whatever that means, is defined by them. And so there was some diversity, but they were all pretty much, had their allegiance to Trump.
I want to talk about the worship side of this because of your book, Weapons of Worship. I want you to talk about weapons of worship a little bit, and then just talk about how that played out, what you saw in this. And then I also want to talk about some of the messages that were being shared. So take this in whatever order you want, but those are the two big themes. Also, maybe give us a little bit of breakdown of how many people were there, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So basically, as far as how many people were there, it's kind of interesting because there's been a lot of people that have offered criticism of the events. There were two events, actually. There was a Sean Feucht event Saturday night that was not sponsored by the government. It was independent. And then there was the Trump administration's event on Sunday. And the number one question I've gotten from people from over the weekend regarding both events was how many people were there. And for one thing, I kind of feel like I'm a bad judge of numbers. I don't know how to really estimate a crowd, so I wouldn't put, gospel behind my numbers. But I used to lead worship at a megachurch, and Sean Feucht's gathering felt like at least that. So you're talking a few thousand. And so some people were criticizing Feucht when he said thousands were there. I felt like thousands were there.
Yeah.
At the Trump administration's event, people noticed there were empty chairs at the front. And so, the Daily Beast put out an article saying that Trump was humiliated speaking to mostly empty seats. But those seats at the front were reserved for specific people. And so if they didn't show up, those seats would have been empty. And then also it was blasting hot outside. And so a lot of the people were cramming underneath the trees around the perimeter. And so there was there was a lot of people there. It took 3 hours to get in, and it took me an hour and 50 minutes just to get lunch. So I think when we're going to criticize this, I think I understand the fascination with crowd size, especially when Trump plays into that a lot. But I think we need to focus more on the messages that are being promoted by people who actually do have power.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I think of it more as, if I'm interested in the size, it would be more in the television audience. I'd be very curious how many people watched this, because these messages are going out. And I think there are a lot of people who see something like this happen. And, there's all these government officials there, and they think, yay, God, government officials are talking about God. And so these messages, I assume millions of people witnessed this. That's just my baseline assumption.
And there will be a lot of clips going around now, and a lot of them will be shared by people who critique the Trump administration, because a lot of what was said at the event was pretty wild and out there. So
why don't we start with the worship stuff? Because we talked about your book, Weapons of Worship, last month, and it's coming out in October. Is that right?
September 29th.
September, yeah. And so talk about this event in light of your book. I feel like you're the perfect correspondent to have at this event. Yeah,
so it's interesting because in my book, I talk about this opening scene where Sean Feucht led worship on the National Mall last year. Or no, 2024, actually. He's done it every year. And in 2024, his opening was, he said, we are the family of God, we are the army of God. And so you have both of those two things, those ideas, like those identities. We're a family and we're an army. We're trying to attract our neighbors to our good Father, and we're trying to fight our neighbors in this political battle because they're our enemies. And so you had like both of those play out at these events. Sean Feucht's event Saturday night it's going to have much more of a spiritual warfare vibe to it. You know, you've got Greg Locke there, he's rebranded himself as the Demon Slayer. So he was there. Mark Driscoll was there. Eric Metaxas, and so these are very angry men, and so there's this very angry warfare type battle feel to it. The Trump service the next day, it was really interesting because, for one, it was Sunday morning, so these people are normally in church. And it started in the 10 o'clock hour, like you'd normally, people would be going to church. And so we're like sitting around, and they've got this like temple looking background thing behind the stage. And they've got this music playing on the speakers. And it's just this light contemporary Christian worship music stuff you'd hear from Chris Tomlin or Hillsong. Like it felt like the pre-service music that you'll hear at a megachurch.
Okay.
As people are walking in. So it just felt very casual, comfortable, it felt like you were at a megachurch, but outside. And then basically like the first section of it was very much that megachurch band worship type feel. There wasn't scripture readings. It was like, songs with some emotional prayers in between and going from one song to the next. And then the afternoon was a little bit more programmed, where they had like the military bands or a choir come in from Hillsdale College or Liberty University, and they had some worship bands mixed in with that. And then at the end, it really all culminated with Chris Tomlin. And with Tomlin, it was interesting because his first song that he brought up was the song "Good Father," and so that's this whole family vibe. He's drawing everyone in, like, you're a good father. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. And so it all feels like very intimate, and we're this family. And then the next songs that he went into from there was like, our God is greater, and our God is stronger. Our God is higher than any other. If God is for us, who could ever stop us? How great is our God? He's the name above all names. And so these are all very popular songs. Any evangelical megachurch are going to
I led
recognize
several of those songs when I led worship back in the day. So familiar to me. Did it feel like with somebody like Chris Tomlin or with any of these worship leaders, were they, and the event in general, were they trying to be apolitical, more like just general God loves America, God bless America? Or did it have an edge, like especially the worship stuff? I'm curious first if that had an edge of any politicization.
Yeah. So, well, the Sean Feucht stuff was definitely very explicitly political. So he opened with a Native American in his full headdress garb. I don't know what it's technically called, but he's up there and he has this Native American inviting everybody in, to all these white people, to this worship gathering. And then he speaks in his native tongue. He prays in his native tongue. And then Sean Feucht gets up and thanks God for what God did on the reservations and in the colonies.
Oh.
And it's like, so immediately, and then Feucht goes into, from there, he starts talking about you can't criticize us for not being diverse. Look at the diversity here. Wow. And so it's like very much, defensive, attack the liberal scripts about us being a bunch of white people. I've got my Native American person, my black person, my Hispanic person. So and that's all interwoven with the music.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Trump one was, you had some of the patriotic songs, especially with Trump's personal band playing and stuff. I think with that one, it was just a lot of prayers about humbling ourselves before God, like repenting and being one nation under God. And then the speakers come in and kind of fill in the blanks of what exactly that means.
I know it's probably controversial for people to say they shouldn't be there, because I know a lot of people would say, hey, any opportunity that I get to worship Jesus, on a national stage, why wouldn't I do that? And for me, it's because it's paired with a message and paired with a group of people who are about as far away from the gospel as you can get. And you're doing all this in Jesus' name. So that's my concern. And so that leads to my next question, which is, was I right about that in terms of the messages, or what were the messages like?
Yeah, so as far as it's interesting because the worship, take Tomlin's for example. Our God is greater, our God is stronger, our God is higher than any other. So most Christians, most evangelicals especially, are going to say our God is the greatest. That's just a fact. Our God is the highest. He's the God most high. What's wrong with saying that? It's in the Bible, And then the bridge says, if God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And again, sure, you can make an argument that's in the Bible, but you got to understand the context of who's singing this. And when you've got a bunch of people who have their allegiance to the Trump administration, to the Trump administration's policies toward immigrants, toward black people, toward LGBTQ people, toward whoever doesn't bend the knee to them, and they're saying our God is the highest, and who could ever stop us? Well, then they've got this spiritual language that they've now been swept up into all of this emotion with this band, and they're ready to go. Lou Angle's getting them all riled up. He's getting them to everyone to bend the knee. So literally around the mall, everyone's bending the knee to the cause, and he's getting them to be what will you do? Whatever it takes. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, what does doing whatever it takes to this cause of making the nation one nation under God mean exactly?
Right.
And that's where things start to, you have questions.
And I think there's some important context here that I'm gonna bring up. The people organizing this event, I heard, was the same company that organized the January 6th speech, with Trump and everything, that did the logistics and that kind of stuff. I've heard that was the same company that did that. The worship people, whether they were the exact same people or not, I'm speaking especially about Sean Foyt and the NAR type, the New Apostolic Reformation types that were involved in January 6th. Because you can say, well, what's the harm in this? Well, the harm at January 6th was there was this spiritual, warfare motif going on through the whole thing. There was a lot of worship music being played, and the people stormed the Capitol. And so at the time, people said, well, we didn't mean for that to happen, and that was bad, and I'm not going to support Trump. Well, since then, Trump has not only pardoned the January 6th rioters, and none of his supporters seem to be taken aback by that. But today we learn that he's asking to create a $1.776 billion slush fund that his people can administer to pay the rioters and other people who were, they say, experienced weaponization of Biden's Justice Department. So this is the context for this. And so when somebody asks, well, what's the harm in just singing some songs? If you've got a government-sanctioned worship service stirring people up and, like you say, getting them to bend the knee, and then you've got pardons for anyone who gets a little out of hand and does whatever is necessary, the word that you just used, that's a little bit alarming to me.
Yeah, you look at, you think about just another context, for example, athletes when they're going to go into a game, an NFL player, they're often in the locker room with the headphones on, and they're listening to music to get them hyped up to go do something. And in the same way, you've got these evangelical Christians getting all hyped up about our God being the highest and the greatest and better than everyone else, and no one can stop us. Okay, what game are they getting ready to enter then? Because there's no mention of God on the underside of power. There's no mention of God in and among the least of these. And all of that is, Christian theology is capable of identifying God in and among the least of these, but that's not what is mentioned. It's really a worship of power.
And so then, what were some of the messages? What were some of the themes that you saw?
So the general theme over the weekend was rededicating the nation to being under God, one nation under God. And so then basically it becomes like, what does that mean exactly? And so they rooted it in this idea of God as the creator, that we're endowed by our creator with these inalienable rights. And so there's this order, this hierarchy that lines up under God as creator. And so then all of these concepts then get defined within that hierarchy. So, for example, history, when they're talking about our history and our story, they rewrite it as basically being written by God. And so, I mentioned the Foyt situation where he's talking about what happened with the Native Americans as being something to praise God for. Like, there's no reflection on the violence or the genocide. There's no mourning or grief or lament. It's just celebration of what God did. Right. Eric Metaxas he spoke at both events, and he talked about how he said the founders were all fire-breathing, born-again believers, and even those who weren't agreed with all the doctrines. And he said anybody who tells you that our founders, a lot of them were deists, are lying to you. Mark Driscoll kind of said the same thing. He said the Pilgrims were actually young men in their teens and 20s who were all biblical Christians.
What I was going to say about Eric Metaxas is just someday we should do a show where we just talk about what happened. Because some of these people, I just really wonder, and we can't get inside their head, but does he really believe that all of these people were born again? Or is he just doing slogans at this point?
Yeah.
And that's what I wonder whenever I hear these people talk in front of a large crowd. And I wonder, do the speakers believe it? And I wonder, does the crowd believe it? Or are we just all winking and nodding at each other, and we all know we're just worshiping the fact that, hey, we've got political power now? I wonder when I listen to them.
Yeah, it's weird because they'll say things like that. Like Bishop Robert Barron said that the founding fathers were biblical Christians almost to a man. And then everybody just erupts and cheers, and I'm just like, how are you guys not scratching your heads right now over how this doesn't make sense with reality? Like, it's when the Bible talks about people having itching ears, it very much feels like that in these contexts. You throw out a slogan there about everybody being biblical, everybody being about the gospel in the founding fathers, and it's like, everybody cheers and it's like, yeah. And then the worship gets them even more riled up.
Yeah, the one part that I did watch so far today was it said Trump's full speech, and it can't possibly be the full speech, because all it was the clip of him reading the Bible, reading that passage that he read. And what I heard in the crowd was when he got, for the America Reads the Bible event a couple of weeks ago, that clip. And when he got to the part, if my people who are called by my, and then I hear the crowd just erupting, hearing the President of the United States saying these words that are so precious to them. And I think, it sounded like they genuinely are excited to hear him say it. And I don't know I don't know how they add that all up. I mean, did you talk to some of these people who were there? Did you meet anyone that could help you understand?
Yeah. So I was standing in the lunch line, and I was there it took an hour and 50 minutes to get my lunch. So there's a little bit of time. I didn't want to get too much into conversation because I don't want to get too many questions when I'm held hostage for an hour of waiting.
Yeah, right.
I don't want to be too critical of them, what they're there for, but I was listening to them, and when a speaker would come up, they're like, "Is that Pete Hegseth? Is that Pete Hegseth?" And for me, it's like Pete Hegseth is this very kind of scary figure.
Right.
And the way he brings a lot of this language in, but for them, it was like they were on the edge of their seat. Like, is that Pete Hegseth? Is that Lou Engle? And all these men who promote violence, it was like they're heroes.
And that's what happens when you put people of Pete Hegseth's character into high power, a position of high power. he's going to have an effect on the nation, on the character of the nation, just like Donald Trump does, because people do look up to these people. So, yeah.
And they saw this as different. Like, this isn't just us saying, oh, this is a different event than what was done in the past, and this is concerning. Like, they brought that out. Lou Engle was talking about how, he said, we've been doing these events for the last 26 years on the National Mall, and this is the first time we had a U.S. president sponsor it and say, I want this to happen. And so in their mindset, this was a level up.
You talked to me earlier about how, there's a lot of talk about one nation under God. And so you mentioned how, it starts with God as the creator and then everything flows down. Talk more about that, about how this messaging worked.
Yeah, so there were two real ideas that I think got redefined in terms of that hierarchy, and one of them was freedom, and the other one was equality. And so, like, when we think about, it was interesting because when they were talking about freedom, Bishop Barron said that freedom is essential to human dignity, and I would agree with that. He said nobody wants to be under the boot of somebody else. Nobody wants to be oppressed, put down, ignored, or bossed around. And so, like, there were moments like that in this where they're talking about people like this that I felt like, yeah, I can resonate with that. Nobody wants to be oppressed, and I'm on board with this, But then he basically went on to say that freedom, though, has to be defined within this hierarchy of God's authority. And he said that freedom of choice is the freedom of choice that dominates many people today is an arbitrary freedom. So you can't just be free as an American to live according to your values and beliefs and your conscience. That's not what true freedom is. He said that freedom must be for excellence, and which he defined as the liberty to choose, not as the liberty to choose, but as the disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. So all of this sounds like philosophical, heady stuff, like what does that even mean in the really everyday life? And then he got into an example, and he said that a skilled musician, for a skilled musician to be free playing their instrument, they have to submit to the laws of the instrument. And so he said, law is the friend of freedom because it shapes desire in accord with the good. And that's the kind of freedom the founders are talking about. And so in the United States, in this idea of the United States being defined as under God and being rededicated to under God, it means freedom is only living in submission to God's law.
Wow. And so that was the question I was going to ask, like, based on the way you described what he said, is he saying, this seems like more than just a pastor saying, because like as a pastor, I could talk to somebody about, well, and the Apostle Paul, talks about freedom, but don't use your freedom, for wrong. But that's all pastoral kind of language. But when you're standing on stage at a government-sponsored event, it sounds like he's saying the kind of freedom that we thought we had as Americans really should be under God in a legal sense, not just in a pastoral sense, giving someone advice.
Yes, because he didn't say this is the kind of freedom that Paul talked about or that Jesus talked about. He said this is the kind of freedom that the founders were talking about.
Yeah.
And so, like, then you got Eric Metaxas again. And he said, when he was talking about the founders again, he said every one of them understood that we are about God's business. So what does the founders' understanding that we're about God's business means? He said that they all understood the narrative. So again, okay, well, what's the narrative? He said the narrative was that we are reestablishing the Sinai covenant. We are reestablishing the idea that we have no king but the Lord, that we look to him directly, and it is only by looking to the Lord directly and bowing to his authority and loving him, it is the only way that we can be free. So that's a theocracy.
Wow. Yeah. So they're just saying it out loud.
Yeah.
They're just...
He explicitly said, we're going to govern ourselves the way the Israelites did at Sinai. It hasn't been done since. So now, with that context in mind, you throw in a worship band with Chris Tomlin, like the most best-selling artist of all time in Christian music up there, and he's really good. Like, it was enjoyable to listen to in person, and he's got everybody whipped up about our God is the greatest, our God is the highest, and nobody can stop us. With right after you've been talking about all this stuff about this new covenant and reestablishing all this stuff, like it creates a context of what these people are being whipped up into. And it's ironic too, because you think even from like a Christian standpoint, like it almost makes a lot of the Christian theology about Jesus feel pointless, because like how I thought Jesus was supposedly fulfilling the covenant, or was a new covenant according to Christian theology, and it's like, well, what does that even mean if we're going back to before all that?
Yeah. And this is what I and it's too big of a topic for us to solve today, but it goes back to my wondering about what do they actually believe versus what is a political organizing message, and that's what's been so hard for me to sort out forever, because the message collapses in on itself at some point. 'Cause like you just talked about, like, oh, so are we Christian or are we pre-Jesus in our theology? And because if you just grab one here and one there because the passage works for your argument, in the end it just collapses in on itself.
Yeah, and equality is basically the same deal in this conversation. They talked about how human equality also has to be based in the idea of God's created order, and so, like he said, Bishop Barron said, all people, despite their enormous inequalities, which he talked about how people are unequal in size, intelligence, creativity, beauty, energy, moral virtue, etc. He said, all people, despite their enormous inequalities, are equally children of God and therefore equal in dignity. So again, okay, I agree, we're equal in dignity.
Right.
But then
you can hear the but coming.
Yeah. Take God out of the equation and equality quickly disappears.
When it's coming from this group of people who, they haven't earned my trust. I'll put it this way. They haven't earned my trust, over the course of the past 10 years, when I'm seeing people dragged out of cars in my town, and because by ICE, that sort of thing. And I see people shot in the streets. I see people shipped off to El Salvador. And so what it sounds like to me is, and maybe this is unfair, but what that sounds like to me is, without God, there is no equality. We are the ones who speak for God. So therefore, we can define equality, and we can define the limits of equality. Does that seem like a fair assessment?
And the order of equality. So again, with all of this in the created order, that then has gender role distinctions, because like complementarian Christians will say men and women are equal. They're equal in dignity, but they have different roles. And so it really it's an equality that demands male headship and female submission. Right. Which is, at that point, are you really equal?
Right.
And
and that's what I was hearing when you were saying what he said about equality. That's exactly what is the exact same kind of language that you hear in complementarian circles. So what were, just kind of like drawing it to a close, what were just a couple of thoughts that you have about this in general? How would you summarize the experience for people?
It's kind of, I don't know, it's hard to figure out like what to say at times, because for a lot of people, their awareness of U.S. history just doesn't exist. Their awareness, their care about power dynamics doesn't exist. These are all red flags if you talk about what we did to Native Americans or to slaves.
Right.
Like, those are triggers to them that will shut them down. And so, and for me to criticize a song about like our God is greater, it's like one of the number one hit songs ever, like what's so dangerous about this? And so I don't know that there's really much that I can say to people who just don't have the awareness or the care to examine how those things affect people. Because quite frankly, like whether that's true or not, whether there's a hierarchy of gods and the evangelical God is the highest or not, to me doesn't really matter. What matters is how these scripts are affecting people. And as we saw in the event yesterday, it really led to emphasizing this rise of conservative Christian men. And it was all about the founding fathers were all men. We're here for young men to rise up and to fight battles like our founding fathers did. They need to create businesses. They need to lead their families as husbands and fathers. And really, women were pretty absent in this event. Mark Driscoll, as he's talking to these women on Saturday, or to the men on Saturday night, he's telling them all of this hero stuff about how they're soldiers and they're fighters and they're business builders. The only thing he mentioned to women was he said, "You have been brainwashed to hate Jesus Christ, to despise the Bible, and to reject femininity." He had nothing positive to say to the women. And so I think, one takeaway I have is just, it's lament for the women who are there, that's the extent to which they, hear about God. And then also for just people who they get so caught up in the music and so caught up in the buzzwords that all of these dynamics and the dehumanization just kind of fly over their head.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really appreciate you going there and reporting on it for us, because it's not easy to be around that sort of thing. For myself, I've been doing this for 10 years in one form or another. And it's that I never get past this lament part that you talked about. I never get past that of just like, today I mentioned this, $1.776 billion slush fund that Trump is trying to do, for people who've been abused by the Biden administration, and the lament comes in to me thinking, if I tried to tell some of these Christian Trump supporters about this, I would have to, where would I even start? If you don't see why that's corrupt and wrong, and where do you start? And so it's interesting you use that word lament, because I've never gotten past lament. I get angry, but the lament part of it just never goes away, watching people fall for this stuff.
Yeah, and that was when I led worship for 20 years. Before getting into journalism, that was the one critique I always had in the different churches I was in. The pastors told me that I led too many songs of lament and not enough celebration. And looking back, I think we probably could use some more sitting and lament, and not just being celebrating our certainties all the time.
Well, thank you, Rick Pidcock. I really appreciate you coming on here. And again, I want to tell people, you can pre-order his book, Weapons of Worship. This event this weekend is just such a perfect example of everything that Rick is talking about in that book, and it'll be out in September. So pre-orders are available for that already. And so, thanks again, Rick. I really appreciate you being here.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for listening.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.